Marilynn Monroe. Marilynn Monroe's life was filled with constant reinvention, and that included her religious views. Early on, she was baptized into Christianity, though she never fully embraced its teachings in adulthood. Instead, she drifted into personal uncertainty. When she married playwright Arthur Miller, she became interested in Judaism, even undergoing a formal conversion. However, her letters and comments suggest she never felt deep spiritual assurance from any single faith. Rather than holding to a strict tradition, she took a questioning stance, describing herself at times as a Jewish agnostic. This blended identity reflected the restlessness that defined her personal life. Monroe often searched for comfort in the midst of fame and chaos, but she also retained a skeptical edge. Some of her closest friends noted that while she kept a few religious keepsakes, they served more as symbols of her journey than as tokens of unshakable belief. In the end, she remained torn between finding peace in faith and leaning on her own questioning nature. Hugh Hefner. Hugh Hefner's name usually conjures images of lavish parties and a controversial magazine empire, but his perspective on religion was equally provocative. He was adamant that organized faith, in his view, was a means to restrain human curiosity and freedom. Early in his career, he saw how religious strictness often clashed with new ideas about individual liberation. As Playboy gained cultural traction, Hefner hosted debates on subjects like morality and spirituality. Inviting people from varied backgrounds to discuss topics he felt traditional religion ignored or stifled. Although some criticized him for promoting an anything-goes mindset, he argued that thinking individuals should have the autonomy to explore life without dogmatic boundaries. To him, reason and personal experience were more trustworthy than sacred texts. By openly questioning religion's authority, he paved the way for a candid cultural dialogue. Though many found his style shocking, Hefner never apologized for his skepticism, claiming it was a necessary step toward intellectual honesty. Gloris Leachman. Gloris Leachman may be best remembered for her comedic roles and unconventional wit, but behind those moments of hilarity lay a self-confident skepticism toward religious dogma. Throughout her long career, she made it clear that she took life's lessons from personal experience rather than any official doctrine. She expressed that she wasn't anti-spiritual. She simply preferred to keep her mind open, refusing to be bound by rules and commandments she considered antiquated. Interviews reveal she believed in thinking for herself, asserting that questioning everything was the only way to remain genuine. This mindset spilled into her roles on television and in film, where she was drawn to characters who defied expectations. Off-camera, she rarely attended religious services, joking that she didn't need a congregation to feel centered or moral. By trusting her own instincts and insights, Leachman exemplified a brand of independence that few Hollywood stars dared to admit during her era. This approach, along with her comedic timing, earned her both fans and critics. But she wouldn't have had it any other way. Warren Mitchell's name became synonymous with sharp, satirical comedy, thanks largely to the character he portrayed on British television. Yet beyond that performance lay a man who held pointed views on religion. He saw rigid doctrines as lacking in humor and relevance, arguing that life should be approached with open-ended curiosity. Mitchell often joked that sermons weren't his cup of tea, because he believed answers came more from living than from preachy lectures. This attitude reflected his broader perspective on social and cultural norms. He believed that mindless adherence to long-standing beliefs robbed people of the chance to think critically about their world. His irreverent approach, though controversial, also earned him a loyal fan base who appreciated his blend of humor and candor. Over time, Mitchell's commentary on religious traditions interwove with his critique of outdated societal rules, reinforcing his identity as someone who tested boundaries. Whether on stage or off, he channeled that skepticism into direct, comedic observations that left audiences amused, and sometimes challenged in their views. George C. Scott, known for his commanding screen presence and no-nonsense demeanor, George C. Scott carried that same forthright attitude into his stance on religion. He didn't see the value in following rules just for tradition's sake, instead arguing that a person's moral code ought to stem from fairness and human decency. Raised in a conventional environment, he gradually realized he couldn't reconcile strict religious expectations with his personal convictions. He believed that genuine insight came from what he called paying attention to real life, not from blindly following texts passed down through centuries. Scott's preference for honesty extended to all aspects of his existence. He famously refused an Oscar in 1971, citing philosophical disagreements with award ceremonies. This willingness to buck tradition carried into how he thought people should approach faith, which is to say, with open eyes and a willingness to question. His take on spirituality was rooted in respect for evidence and lived experience, marking him as both a rebel and a champion for critical thinking in an era when open doubt was still frowned upon. Kenneth Tynan. Kenneth Tynan built a reputation as a brilliant critic and playwright, unafraid to challenge the status quo. His razor-sharp wit wasn't limited to theater reviews. It also cut through religious conventions he considered antiquated. Tynan believed that creativity flourishes when individuals are free to test boundaries, which he felt were often policed by organized faith. Although he admired the cultural heritage tied to religion, things like majestic architecture and centuries of literature, he also called out what he viewed as repressive doctrines. During the televised debates and in his written critiques, Tynan underscored the tension between tradition and innovation, suggesting that clinging too tightly to dogmas hampers true artistic exploration. Critics slammed him for being too provocative, especially when his works touched on taboo topics. Yet Tynan insisted that provoking thought was his job. In doing so, he made a lasting impact on how people engaged with both art and belief, reminding the world that asking blunt questions is often the first step toward genuine understanding. Stanley Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick was famously meticulous, sometimes spending years perfecting a single film. This intellectual rigor extended to how he viewed religion. He wasn't one to pronounce grand statements about faith or the lack thereof in public settings, but his movies spoke volumes. In works like 2001: A Space Odyssey, Kubrick raised profound questions about humanity's origins, purpose, and moral compass, rarely hinting at a divine hand. He considered it more meaningful to explore uncertainty rather than accept an all-powerful deity. When asked about spirituality, he would often divert the conversation to themes of human nature and cosmic wonder, suggesting that life's mysteries are best examined through observation and innovation. Kubrick's quiet, private persona left much of his personal worldview open to interpretation. Still, it's clear that he prioritized empirical thinking. He credited human creativity for progress, instead of ascribing achievements to supernatural forces. In this way, he transformed cinema into an arena for grand philosophical inquiry, urging audiences to think beyond established norms and carve their own paths to understanding. Alejandro Jodorowsky might seem like an odd fit on a list of non-believers, given the mystical imagery in his films and his emphasis on spiritual healing practices. Yet he stands apart because he rejects any formal institutional religion. He doesn't rely on a single deity or abide by the rituals of established faiths. Instead, he fused symbols from numerous traditions, everything from tarot readings to Eastern philosophies, into what he calls psychomagic, a form of personal transformation he believes anyone can explore. Over the years, Jodorowsky has advocated that art itself can be a spiritual tool, unencumbered by the constraints of dogma. His films, such as The Holy Mountain, are often dreamlike, blending surreal visuals with existential questions. While some accuse him of concocting a new type of religious cult, he insists it's the opposite. He encourages people to find their own answers rather than submit to a higher authority. His approach exemplifies an intensely personal quest for meaning, one that avoids mainstream dogmas in favor of artistic, self-directed spirituality. Clint Eastwood's gruff, quietly confident persona matches his straightforward outlook on religion. He has described himself as agnostic, indicating he isn't sure if a higher power exists and doesn't feel compelled to settle on a formal belief system. Instead, he relies on personal judgment, a sense of fairness, and decades of lived experience to guide his moral choices. Eastwood's cinematic storytelling, whether as an actor or a director, often dwells on themes of justice, redemption, and ethical complexity. But rarely do his narratives hinge on divine intervention. He respects that many viewers come from faith backgrounds, yet he doesn't tailor his work to any specific religious audience. Interviews show he's a believer in common-sense solutions over ritualistic practices. His open acceptance of doubt has sparked countless discussions, especially in an industry where many quietly maintain religious affiliations. Eastwood's stance underscores a broader shift in Hollywood, where skepticism is more openly tolerated than it was in earlier decades. He remains a living example of someone willing to say, "I don't know," and accept that as part of the human experience. Paul Taylor revolutionized modern dance, breaking away from the established forms that had long dominated the art. His boundary-pushing spirit also extended to religion. Raised with traditional values, Taylor soon discovered that a rigid belief system didn't harmonize with his drive to experiment. He found dance more enlightening than any sermon, feeling that movement captured truths about human existence in ways dusty old doctrines never could. Instead of looking to a higher power, he relied on the raw power of creativity to convey life's emotional range. Taylor's performances often showcase themes of irony and subversion, hinting that conventional faith might be out of touch with real-world human struggles. Yet, he rarely criticized religion outright. He simply placed more trust in the immediacy of dance and personal expression. Over decades of choreography, he honed a philosophy that championed critical thinking and artistic freedom, values he believed led to more genuine understanding. His legacy in dance remains monumental, forever entwined with the notion that faith in human potential can surpass the need for rigid spiritual codes. Paul Mazursky. Paul Mazursky became known for crafting films that explored the delicate undercurrents of ordinary life, stories of relationships, identity crises, and personal reinvention. This focus on human fragility and everyday humor often sidestepped religious explanations for why people behave as they do. Raised in a culture where religious traditions were common, Mazursky eventually grew to question whether these customs truly explained human nature or just confined it. He believed that the real drama lay in daily interactions, flawed characters, and emotional honesties that transcend dogma. By highlighting the messy realities of existence, he gently challenged the idea that life's mysteries could be answered by ancient texts. In interviews, he indicated he saw more spiritual truth in a well-told story than in any single religious doctrine. Though his critiques were rarely scathing, his films implicitly suggested that authentic connection and empathy should guide moral decisions, not a fear of divine punishment. Mazursky's openness to questioning beliefs gave his work a distinctly modern feel, resonating with viewers who also found themselves drawn more to human complexity than to religious strictness. Mike Nichols. Mike Nichols was a master at dissecting human relationships on stage and screen, bringing us stories that were both comedic and unsettling. Raised in a faith-inclined environment, he gradually stepped away from structured doctrines, arguing that the true magic of life emerges from the rawness of genuine emotion and interaction. Nichols became a proponent of using humor as a mirror to reflect everyday truths, rather than looking for cosmic answers in religious texts. His work, ranging from the comedic to the dramatic, often showcased characters grappling with moral dilemmas outside of any traditional spiritual guidance. He thought people should confront life's complexities head-on, relying on empathy and reflection over ritual. This open-minded approach not only shaped his creations, but also influenced how he collaborated with other artists. Nichols believed that when individuals remove the filter of dogma, they can better appreciate both the irony and the wonder in human behavior. It's no surprise that his films still resonate with audiences who see in them a refreshing honesty, unhindered by devotion to any formal creed. Paolo Villaggio. Paolo Villaggio's comedy was best known for turning everyday frustrations into clever satire. Italian audiences loved how he poked fun at entrenched customs, and religion was no exception. Though he came from a Catholic background, like many Italians of his generation, Villaggio soon found that strict observances didn't speak to him. He turned to humor, pointing out the absurdities of ritual and how it can become more theatrical than spiritual. In his widely popular Fantozzi series, he portrayed the ordinary man's trials, implicitly questioning a system where blind faith sometimes overshadowed practicality. Villaggio believed that laughter had the power to show people the illogical nature of certain traditions, nudging them to reflect on why they do what they do. Over time, he made it clear he didn't reject faith entirely. He merely distrusted institutions that insisted on unwavering compliance. His comedic approach was unique in that it never felt malicious. Instead, It invited viewers to wonder whether their life choices stemmed from genuine conviction or just old, inherited habits. François Truffaut emerged as a critical figure in the French New Wave, reshaping cinema with a raw, intuitive style. Raised in a conventional setting that included religious influences, he grew disillusioned with rote practices and found deeper inspiration in personal storytelling. In classics like The 400 Blows, he tackled youth, freedom, and the search for identity without turning to a religious framework. Truffaut believed art should capture the actual texture of existence, including all its moral and emotional complexities. He rarely criticized religion outright. Instead, his films subtly steered a conversation away from doctrines and toward personal growth. He valued the small, authentic moments of daily life, seeing in them a certain truth that organized religion often overlooks. Audiences connected with this unfiltered portrayal of human nature, and critics praised his fresh approach. Truffaut remained adamant that focusing on one's lived experiences could reveal more about the human spirit than any sermon. Through his storytelling, he encouraged a shift from external authority to internal contemplation, an idea that still resonates with viewers worldwide. Joan Bakewell, famous for his flamboyant style and outspoken persona in British horse racing coverage, was never shy about voicing direct opinions, even those touching on religion. Although his public image often revolved around sports commentary, behind the eccentric hats and larger-than-life personality was a man who questioned the role of dogma in everyday life. McCririck felt that personal freedom mattered more than adhering to established beliefs. Fans noticed he rarely invoked spiritual motivations and instead cited practical, real-world reasons for his actions and stances. In interviews, he occasionally lamented what he considered the undue influence of religious institutions on politics and social norms, finding them overly restrictive. While some saw his approach as an act, many recognized genuine skepticism running beneath the showmanship. McCririck's candor reflected an evolving cultural sentiment that valued human-driven solutions over waiting for divine intervention. Though racing was his stage, his influence stretched beyond it, marking him as a distinctive voice ready to question everything, including the traditions folks often accept without a second thought. John Davidson's all-American image as a singer and television personality might suggest a wholesome, tradition-following background, and indeed he was brought up with standard religious values. However, as he delved deeper into show business, Davidson found that new experiences challenged the beliefs he once assumed to be universal. Constantly on the move, performing for diverse audiences, and interacting with all sorts of creative minds, he realized that morality and kindness don't depend on a single holy text. Davidson began placing more value on personal choice, empathy, and the sense of wonder that comes with artistic expression. In his interviews, he rarely condemned religion outright, instead emphasizing that each person must find what resonates with them. Over time, his focus shifted from traditional worship to the exhilaration of life's stage, a fitting metaphor for how he approached spirituality. The applause, the human connections, and the creativity he witnessed daily became more compelling than any strict dogma he'd inherited in his youth. Sylvester McCoy's role as a certain time-traveling doctor opened up a universe of possibilities, and off-screen, he also explored a broader realm of thought that wasn't tied to the religious norms of his upbringing. He started out in a context where Sunday church visits were routine, but as he immersed himself in theatrical and television roles that demanded imagination, he found old traditions less satisfying. McCoy gravitated toward the idea that humans should actively shape their destinies instead of leaning on higher powers for guidance. His portrayal of whimsical yet curious characters mirrored his own approach to faith. Question everything, adapt often, and never lose your sense of wonder. Over the years, McCoy's reluctance to adopt a formal spiritual label has led fans to interpret him as a champion for independent thought. Whether performing comedic skits or delving into darker storylines, he consistently returned to the theme that people can find hope and meaning in each other, rather than in rituals passed down through generations. Bernardo Bertolucci. Bernardo Bertolucci grew up amid Italy's strong Catholic traditions, but he leaned into cinema as a vehicle for grappling with life's big questions rather than looking for answers in the pew. His films often tackled controversial themes, political upheaval, intimate relationships, and psychological power plays, subjects that religious censors found objectionable. Yet Bertolucci wasn't aiming to shock for the sake of it. Instead, he believed that realistically depicting human struggle revealed deeper truths about society than church teachings often acknowledged. He became increasingly convinced that reason and personal morality could handle ethical dilemmas more effectively than strict dogmas. His willingness to explore taboo topics led to friction in certain circles, but it also cemented his place among Europe's cinematic greats. In interviews, Bertolucci emphasized that while religion can inspire beautiful art, it can also stifle bold, necessary questions. By challenging inherited assumptions, he championed a future where artists and audiences alike dared to reflect on life without relying on prepackaged, sanctified answers. Peter Greenaway's elaborate visual style marked him as one of the most distinctive filmmakers of his generation. He wasn't shy about integrating complex symbolism or references to art history into his work, much of which implicitly questioned the neat moral divides often propped up by religion. Raised in a culturally Christian milieu, Greenaway took a sharp turn away from orthodox belief systems after discovering the richness of world literature and painting. As he delved deeper into creative expression, he saw religious narratives as limiting, preferring to craft layered stories that challenge viewers to think beyond the obvious. Themes of mortality, the body, and identity fill his films, raising queries about human nature that are rarely answered with tidy spiritual solutions. Greenaway has maintained that curiosity and reason are essential for dissecting the human experience, whereas rigid doctrines can obscure reality's complexity. Though some find his work unnervingly cerebral, he consistently defends the idea that artistry should provoke introspection, not confirm comforting myths. Eric Idle's comedic repertoire is legendary, especially for how it skewered sacred cows and social taboos alongside the rest of Monty Python. From The Life of Brian to countless sketches, Idle poked holes in the seriousness with which many approach religion, mocking everything from dogmatic clergy to the concept of miracles. Yet behind the comedic jabs was a genuine questioning of why societies cling so fiercely to ancient rules. Idle admitted that while he appreciates the beauty and tradition of religious music and architecture, he sees no compelling reason to follow doctrines he finds outdated. Over the years, he's used both stage and page to highlight the absurdities of blind faith, all while encouraging free thought. Even so,
Idol's approach rarely seemed mean-spirited. Rather, he wanted his audience to consider whether tradition alone is enough to justify beliefs. By blending humor with subtle social commentary, he made skepticism more approachable, reinforcing that laughter can be one of the most powerful catalysts for open dialogue about faith. David Cronenberg built a career around exploring the unsettling intersections of mind, body, and science. Born into a society with conventional religious norms, he quickly gravitated toward scientific curiosity and psychological depth, areas he felt were often glossed over by spiritual doctrines. Cronenberg's films like The Fly or Videodrome delve into bodily transformations and the fragility of perception, shedding light on the human condition without resorting to divine causes. He argues that when it comes to explaining life's most eerie or horrifying elements, religion often falls back on good versus evil cliches, whereas science and critical thought grapple head-on with messy realities. Though he rarely makes explicit statements denouncing faith, Cronenberg's body of work signals that human existence can be both fascinating and terrifying without involving supernatural narratives. By focusing on visceral detail and psychological nuance, he encourages viewers to confront both the extremes of the flesh and the anxieties of modern technology. In doing so, he establishes a cinematic realm where the quest for knowledge takes precedence over seeking comfort in spiritual certainties. Katharine Hepburn remains one of Hollywood's most celebrated leading ladies, recognized for her fierce independence both on and off the screen. She was famously quoted saying, "I'm an atheist, and that's it," a statement that was particularly bold given the era. Raised in a well-educated family that championed progressive ideas, Hepburn quickly learned to question the norms of her day, including religious customs. She believed that personal integrity stemmed from common sense and self-reliance rather than devotion to any higher power. Her refusal to conform extended to her fashion choices and her outspoken views on everything from marriage to Hollywood politics. Though some critics labeled her brash for rejecting traditional piety, she never wavered in her convictions. Hepburn's legacy endures as a testament to the idea that art, intelligence, and honesty can thrive without religious frameworks, an attitude that remains refreshing decades after her most famous performances lit up the silver screen. James Whale, best known for directing the 1931 classic Frankenstein, brought a distinctly personal vision to Hollywood horror. Born into a working-class English family, Whale once entertained religious notions out of societal habit, but his experiences in World War I and his immersion in the arts led him to adopt a more skeptical stance. Whale found the grand promises of organized faith lacking when weighed against the harsh realities he witnessed. Instead, he trusted in human creativity and empathy to illuminate life's biggest questions. His films, often steeped in Gothic atmosphere, subtly reflected his tendency to see the world in shades of moral gray rather than in stark terms of sin and salvation. Though Whale rarely trumpeted his non-religious views in public, recognizing how controversial such admissions could be at the time, he privately noted that he drew more solace from painting and theater than from any formal spiritual text. Today, he is remembered for influencing how horror stories are told on film and for quietly challenging the era's religious expectations behind the scenes. Marlene Dietrich embodied glamour and sophistication, but she was also strikingly modern in her personal beliefs. Born in Germany to a relatively conservative family,
Dietrich broke from tradition as soon as she found her footing in show business. Though she enjoyed the pageantry of religious ceremonies, she saw them more as cultural events rather than paths to spiritual truth. Interviews and letters suggest she found greater solace in romantic pursuits, music, and humanitarian efforts than in any church doctrine. Dietrich's irreverent wit and cosmopolitan lifestyle made her a symbol of independence, and she used that platform to speak out against fascism and other forms of authoritarian control, religious or otherwise. While her contemporaries often cloaked themselves in pious respectability, Dietrich openly discussed the fluidity of personal morals, hinting that rigid dogmas simply didn't apply to her life. Audiences adored her for the alluring mystique she projected on screen, but her off-screen candor about questioning faith remains equally compelling. Tallulah Bankhead, a Broadway sensation and Hollywood actress, was infamous for her quick wit, raspy voice, and uninhibited lifestyle. Raised in a prominent political family from Alabama, she encountered all the expected Southern religious conventions, yet she soon realized she didn't fit into that mold. Bankhead relished challenging social norms and found the constraints of organized religion stifling. She preferred intellectual curiosity and candid dialogue, once reportedly joking that the church cautioned her against liquor and men, but said nothing about women or other vices. Whether on stage or attending the era's wild parties, Bankhead showed little regard for preserving an image of saintly devotion. Critics labeled her outspoken and scandalous, but she brushed off the judgments. In doing so, she expanded what it meant to be a female celebrity in early 20th century America, proving you could be both bold and successful without relying on divine endorsement. Even decades later, she remains a larger-than-life figure who exemplified living and questioning on her own terms. Roman Polanski grew up in an environment heavily shaped by Catholic traditions, but his life experiences took him down a very different path. While his personal life is mired in controversial accusations that led to ongoing legal complications, his professional work almost always veers away from traditional religious interpretations. Instead, Polanski's films, such as Rosemary's Baby, explore the darker edges of human psychology, often revealing the ugliest sides of society without invoking the notion that a higher power will step in. In interviews, he's mentioned that the traumas he witnessed early on left him skeptical of any protective deity or comforting religious narrative. Polanski's characters tend to be ordinary individuals thrust into unsettling scenarios, forced to rely on their own wits rather than divine intervention. His cinematic focus remains on moral ambiguity and the fragility of the human psyche. Despite the heated debates surrounding his personal conduct, Polanski's approach to storytelling undeniably shaped modern cinema, continuously raising questions about whether we should look to institutions, be they religious or legal, for clarity, or instead trust our own perception. Larry King became a household name through his decades-long career in broadcasting. Though raised in a Catholic environment, sometimes misstated, in reality he was born to Orthodox Jewish parents, yet he explored various beliefs. He grew to see religion mostly as a personal choice, rather than an absolute truth everyone must share. On his talk shows, he invited priests, rabbis, imams, and atheists alike, treating each perspective with measured curiosity. Rather than endorsing one position, he encouraged listeners to arrive at their own conclusions. King's style was straightforward, never pushing religion as a necessity
or denouncing it entirely. He simply believed in open dialogue and let guests argue their cases. This balanced approach reflected his own open-minded stance, shaped by years of hearing every angle on faith under the sun. He acknowledged that spirituality holds immense value for some, but he questioned whether it deserved a monopoly on moral guidance. King's respect for varied beliefs, coupled with his willingness to question them, made him a unique figure in the media world. Joan Bakewell built a strong reputation as a broadcaster and journalist who wasn't afraid to probe the core of social issues. She was raised in an era where religious services and doctrines were woven into everyday British life. But she gradually found that a purely faith-based view didn't satisfy her curiosity. Instead, Bakewell championed critical inquiry, encouraging people to test beliefs against modern knowledge. On her programs, she often explored existential themes, from ethics in medicine to shifting cultural norms, all without simply deferring to divine authority. She argued that clinging to centuries-old dogma can leave vital questions unanswered. While not overtly combative, Bakewell used her platform to highlight alternatives to traditional religious thinking. Her measured style resonated with audiences seeking nuanced discussions, especially women who felt constrained by certain religious expectations. Over time, Bakewell's perspective served as a bridge for viewers torn between the comfort of familiar rites and the call of progressive ideas. She remains a notable voice for balanced debate in a landscape often dominated by extremes. Woody Allen's films are loaded with existential dread, humor, and endless questions about love, mortality, and the meaning of life. This creative blend comes from a man who's long claimed he doesn't follow a structured religion. Although raised in a Jewish family, Allen gravitated more toward comedic skepticism than to synagogue teachings. He frequently jokes about how implausible he finds the concept of a divine overseer, comparing it to intangible fantasies. This attitude seeps into scripts that feature characters agonizing over God's silence and humanity's absurd place in the universe. His comedic style, laden with neuroses, highlights the cosmic mismatch between human desire and random fate. Over decades of filmmaking, Allen rarely suggested a spiritual resolution. Instead, he left characters and viewers with unanswered questions, implying that perhaps no definitive answers exist. While some interpret this as nihilism, Allen has described it more as a pragmatic acceptance of life's mysteries. Rather than rely on any holy text, he leans on wit and a sense of irony to cope with the unpredictable nature of existence. George Carlin's comedy routines turned societal norms upside down, and religion was one of his favorite targets. He had an uncanny knack for turning a stand-up set into a philosophical challenge. Carlin would describe religious belief, especially the idea of an invisible man in the sky, as something he found both bizarre and oddly funny. Rather than simply mocking believers, he encouraged everyone to question how they came to hold certain truths. He delivered these ideas with a raw, brash style peppered with comedic profanity, which some found refreshing and others found offensive. Carlin saw strict religious doctrines as a hindrance to genuine intellectual freedom. Yet, in between the laughter, he conveyed a serious point. We should rely on real-world evidence and logic instead of tradition or fear. His confrontational approach helped normalize open skepticism in mainstream entertainment, ushering in a new wave of comedians who felt emboldened to challenge authority. Carlin's legacy endures, proving that humor can cut through even the most revered institutions to spark deeper conversations.
Alan Scarfe. Alan Scarfe started out in a deeply religious household, but his ongoing engagement with theater, literature, and film propelled him toward a more secular worldview. As an actor and writer, he found that creativity and intellectual pursuits offered richer explanations of life's mysteries than did the strictly observed routines he'd known as a child. Through roles that demanded empathy, insight, and even moral ambiguity, Scarfe discovered that humanity's true complexity can't be summed up in a single dogmatic lens. Over time, he became comfortable voicing doubts about inherited faith, sharing how each new production introduced him to fresh perspectives. Colleagues noted that he brought a depth to his performances, fueled by a perpetual sense of inquiry. Scarfe rarely attacked religion outright, but made it clear that blind belief wasn't for him. He preferred to search for meaning in hands-on, experiential ways through travel, collaboration, and ongoing education, rather than in the pages of a sacred text. This steady shift away from rigid doctrine solidified Scarfe's belief that art often uncovers truth more intimately than formal religion ever could. Paul Verhoeven's films might be best known for their edgy violence or provocative scenes, but they also reflect a director who has questioned traditional religious claims. Raised with standard faith teachings, he gradually grew skeptical as he saw the disconnect between religious ideals and the real-world complexities of power, sexuality, and politics. Movies like RoboCop and Basic Instinct challenge viewers to confront moral ambiguity rather than rely on any established moral code. Verhoeven has mentioned in interviews that he's more intrigued by what people do under extreme circumstances than by stories of miraculous interventions. This fascination with human behavior fuels his cinematic style, which can come across as cynical or harsh to some. Yet behind it lies a fundamental question. If humans alone are responsible for their actions, does religion help or hinder progress? By weaving these themes into mainstream releases, Verhoeven prodded audiences to question whether centuries-old doctrines fit into modern, rapidly changing societies. While critics often focus on his film's shock value, Verhoeven maintains that pushing boundaries is crucial if art is to remain honest. Ian Smith built his career writing television scripts and working in soap operas, largely in Australia. Although he grew up with the routine of religious services, Smith found his imagination blossomed more vibrantly when unbounded by dogma. As he began crafting fictional worlds filled with love triangles, betrayals, and personal epiphanies, he saw a parallel to real life. People were figuring things out on their own terms, not necessarily looking to a higher authority. Over time, Smith realized he no longer believed in the strict doctrines he'd once taken for granted. His approach became more curious, incorporating new social ideas and psychological insights into his storytelling. He felt that authentic human dilemmas offered more profound lessons than any sermon could. Audiences responded well, sensing the down-to-earth perspective in his plots and characters. By prioritizing evidence from everyday experiences and an openness to new ideas, Smith helped pave the way for storylines that weren't afraid to question cultural norms, including religion's place in modern society. Terry Wogan's gentle, warm style made him a beloved figure in British media. Raised amid strong Catholic customs, he gradually found himself drifting from rigid rituals as he interviewed countless people with differing views.
During his radio shows, Wogan showed a natural curiosity for all angles, asking thoughtful questions without rushing to moral judgments. He admitted that while traditions can be comforting, he wasn't convinced they held the ultimate key to life's truths. Wogan valued kindness and empathy, traits he believed transcended denominational lines. Instead of using the airwaves to promote a single worldview, he welcomed everyone, clergy, skeptics, and spiritual seekers alike, to share experiences. As a result, he facilitated dialogues that reflected the changing religious landscape of his time. By spotlighting diverse perspectives, Wogan illustrated how open-mindedness can enrich public conversation. His transition from a devout upbringing to a more relaxed stance on faith paralleled the shifts many of his listeners were undergoing, making him all the more relatable and cherished. William B. Davis may be best known for his portrayal of a mysterious figure on a cult sci-fi show, yet his own journey away from religious belief was hardly as dramatic. Raised with a typical moral framework, he gradually became a firm supporter of scientific inquiry. His interest in logic and evidence-based reasoning pulled him toward a secular mindset, one that questioned the reliability of ancient scriptures and intangible claims. Davis never framed his stance as a rebellious act. Rather, he saw it as the logical outcome of a thorough, open-minded evaluation of the world. In interviews, he stressed the importance of staying curious and continuously learning, noting that these qualities often clash with the idea of accepting unquestioned dogmas. While he doesn't deny that religion can bring comfort, Davis insists that personal and societal progress emerge from confronting reality's complexities head-on. His calm, measured delivery of these opinions aligns well with his on-screen persona, leaving a subtle but lasting impression about the value of thinking for oneself. Paul Daniels was a charismatic magician whose performances captivated audiences by blending humor with sleight of hand. Growing up, he had the usual exposure to religious customs, but as he honed his craft, he realized that life's real magic might have less to do with faith and more to do with creativity and showmanship. Daniels believed in hard work and the playful manipulation of reality, two elements he found more rewarding than rehearsing or reciting doctrine. His comedic barbs occasionally poked at religious institutions, though he rarely took a hostile tone. Instead, he treated them as part of the wide array of human customs, neither exalted nor demonized. Over time, he came to see reason, inquiry, and a good laugh as more reliable paths to personal satisfaction than weekly church visits. Audiences adored his approach, perhaps because his allusions and witty perspectives made them question what's truly real, both on stage and in life. In his later interviews, Daniels underscored that skepticism isn't the enemy of wonder. It can actually heighten our sense of awe by freeing us to explore without preconceptions. Sir Ian McKellen's commanding presence often brings to mind beloved fantasy sagas and iconic Shakespearean roles. But away from the spotlight, McKellen charted a thoughtful route concerning religion. He was reared in a setting where church attendance was expected, yet it didn't take long for him to notice inconsistencies between religious teachings and the real world around him. Over the years, his experiences, both on stage and in activism, shaped a worldview centered on empathy, equality, and the universal right to question norms. He acknowledged that many individuals find solace in spiritual communities, yet maintained that for him, human connection and compassionate engagement trumped dogmatic rules. McKellen often credits literature for revealing deeper truths about morality than any single scripture. Far from condemning all belief, he simply favored open exploration over rigid adherence. Fans appreciate not just his masterful performances, but also his stance that real growth happens when curiosity and skepticism aren't shamed. This evolution in outlook allowed him to become a strong advocate for various social causes, underscoring that moral responsibility arises from within rather than being mandated from on high. Bruce Lee is celebrated worldwide for revolutionizing martial arts and action cinema, yet his philosophical outlook was every bit as groundbreaking. Although he encountered various religious perspectives growing up, Lee declared he had no religious affiliation, underscoring his preference for personal discipline over spiritual doctrine. He was fond of saying, "Absorb what is useful, discard what is not," a principle he applied as much to living as to fighting. Rather than adhere to a single school of thought, he combined influences from Chinese philosophies, Western boxing, and even psychology. His unwavering emphasis on self-improvement through martial arts resonated deeply with fans seeking alternatives to rigid spiritual models. Lee believed that truth revealed itself through focused practice and self-analysis, not through ceremonial rituals. By forging his own philosophical path, one that championed adaptability, open-mindedness, and constant growth, he shattered the limitations imposed by tradition. To this day, aspiring martial artists and regular fans alike find inspiration in Lee's message that authenticity flourishes when we rely on our inner drive instead of external decrees. Patrick Stewart's journey from a working-class upbringing in England to global acclaim involved re-examining everything he'd once taken for granted, including religion. Early on, he was introduced to a conventional belief system that stressed obedience, but as he matured, Stewart increasingly leaned on logic and empathy to guide him. He often cites his theater background as influential, explaining that it opens new emotional and intellectual horizons. Interacting with diverse roles and colleagues led him to question doctrines that implied unchanging truths. Stewart believes morality is shaped by evolving human understanding, not carved into stone by cosmic dictates. This perspective permeates his roles, whether he's portraying a starship captain grappling with ethical dilemmas or performing Shakespeare's most challenging lines on stage. His calm and reflective manner off-camera also reveals a man who holds kindness and fairness in higher esteem than dogmatic ritual. By openly discussing these views, Stewart has encouraged many fans to think about whether inherited beliefs truly align with their own evolving sense of right and wrong. Peter Fonda gained fame for his countercultural spirit, most notably in Easy Rider, which itself symbolized rebellion against America's entrenched traditions, including religious norms. He came from a Hollywood dynasty, but that never stopped him from forging his own unique identity. In a time when public figures often downplayed dissent, Fonda openly admitted he didn't align with mainstream faith. Instead, he explored the realms of personal freedom, creativity, and social change. He questioned whether formal church structures could handle society's rapid transformations or do justice to the soul-searching he considered essential for any individual. His films and interviews suggested that life's biggest truths emerge from lived experiences, from traveling, meeting new people, and testing one's boundaries. Fonda's skepticism gave him an enduring appeal among those who also felt hemmed in by tradition. Long after the counterculture wave subsided, he remained an advocate for exploring uncharted paths, arguing that self-awareness and empathy carry more weight in shaping behavior than subscribing to centuries-old religious customs.